Hello, good afternoon, everybody. Um, you may notice that I posted in the chat and just asked that if you could to please take a moment to post your name and your agency in the chat, just so that we as the presenters have an idea of who our audience is. And I'd like to welcome you to our talk about how to apply restorative justice principles and diversion programming. My name is Alicia Jimenez, and I am the Restorative Justice Program Analyst for the Office of Dispute Resolution. Our office is located as one of the services offices of the judicial branch, so we're located under the Supreme Court. And we work with the 6 regional state mediation centers, which Casey's is going to talk to you a little bit more about in just a moment. And my role as the Restorative Justice Program Analyst is primarily centered around overseeing the statewide restorative justice programming, developing policies and around restorative justice, and overseeing any evaluation related to RJ programs that are offered through the mediation centers. And so thank you for coming to our talk.
Good afternoon. I'm Claire Nelson, and I'm the Restorative Justice Coordinator for the Mediation Center here in Lincoln, Nebraska. I work primarily with the youth that are referred to us from Lancaster County in 3 different areas: the Project Restore, which is the cases that come through the public school system, diversion cases, and then I also work with juvenile probation cases.
And I'm Casey Cargus. I'm the Executive Director of the Mediation Center here in Lincoln. We're one of 6 centers across the state, part of the system, and I'm going to talk about that a little more. So we welcome everyone. We're excited to be a part of the restorative justice movement within Lancaster County. Lancaster County a few years ago made a decision that they were going to try to infuse restorative practices throughout the entire programming of our county. Before that, just want a little history on the Mediation Center working with the county. We had a case, boy, I bet it was 7, 8 years ago, that we had a church that was broken into. And youth got caught, and the church decided, is there a way to work on this where the youth that were involved with this wouldn't just get into the punishment system, but some way might learn from it so they wouldn't do it again. The county came to us, we worked with the county, we decided to do a restorative justice victim offender mediation is what we called it back then. And I think we trained 30 or 40 mediators who were prepared to work on possible cases that came into the county. What we learned through that process is that we had an awful lot of mediators, facilitators for these cases, and we didn't have a lot of cases, and so there was not a system that was set up yet. So I'm going to use that as the backdrop, but we've learned over the years how to create, to in some way provide this as an opportunity that can be involved with an awful lot of cases. You'll see on the screen that the Mediation Center is one of the 6 centers. When the centers were developed 28 years ago, the idea was in Nebraska, is there a way to provide mediation facilitation for something that would come up that we could use if legislation was passed, we could use it across the state. About half the states do it like Nebraska does, and Nebraska has this opportunity. So when we start talking about the programs we have today, that if you're interested, we have a mediation center that would be able to work with you to try to implement something that I think is pretty exciting that we're doing within Lancaster County. Mediation West, you get a hold of Charles in Scotts Bluff. You'll see the Nebraska Mediation Center across the northeast part of the state, and that's out of Fremont. Concord Center in Douglas and Sarpy County. The Resolution Center, we call us the donut hole, and they're the donut around us out of Beatrice, and Central Mediation Center is located in Kearney. So just a little background on these types of cases. When Lancaster County decided to do this, it was an important partnership that began to develop between the county attorney's office, and for us, very important, is the schools. County attorneys, I think, were working with the county, and like many of you, they went to a program at Georgetown. And out of the Georgetown program, they came back and said, you know, we can implement something that's a program that will help an awful lot of our kids have an opportunity to experience a restorative justice program. And so out of that, they started a program working with the schools that was first called Project Success, and now is called Project Restore. In Project Restore, if something happens within the school and there is a low-level incident that gets from the school to the county attorney now has the opportunity to put it into a program where a restorative justice process, a victim youth conference is what we call, could happen. Lancaster County made some very important decisions of providing people within the county that are part of what I would call diversion, and the diversion people first get the case from the county attorney, and then we work with them. That case gets sent to us. You've been hearing through the past few days some advantages of a restorative process is how quickly we can work with families after an incident. Or if it moves into the court process, Alicia is going to be talking a little bit of the time that it will take for that to move through that process, where if they get an opportunity to go through a restorative process, we can get to it quicker. Also very unique, you'll hear within these processes, is that we not only work with the person who's done the offense, but also the people who have been offended. And so within our systems, rarely is that an opportunity for them to happen. So before all of these programs took place, I like to use a couple examples. One example is, I remember we had one at the mediation center where someone got hit, a youth shot a BB and hit someone in the butt. I'll never forget this case because we had the youth, we had the person who was offended, and the person who was offended really was offended because they thought they were aiming at their butt. And so we brought him in, and you know what? As much as getting hit by the BB is that, oh my gosh, is this what they were trying to do? Is something wrong with me? And it was an opportunity to bring people together, for the person who did the wrong to apologize, and then the person who had been victimized had an opportunity to ask some questions, to set aside some things that they were worried about that weren't real issues. And so it was creating that kind of space. So today what we're going to do is we're going to be talking about an opportunity to in some way move conflict. You know, I can tell as a mediator, some way move conflict into an opportunity towards resolution where we keep the people involved and those who have done the offense in some way to create an opportunity for them to review what they have done and possibly look what they could do differently and work on those that have been offended. So for our presentation today, what we thought we would do is we would do some general examples of some cases that we've seen. And so Claire's going to kind of share with you, hey, here's the kind of cases we've seen. We've asked Claire to come up with 3 different cases. And then Alicia, through her research on these cases, on what we're seeing the impact of a restorative process can make. And so first, I think we're going to start with Claire. And if Claire, will you share some examples that we're going to work through and show what the research is telling?
Okay, thank you, Casey. I'm going to share 3 different cases that we actually did here at the center. Obviously, I've changed names and a few of the details. I'm going to just share with you the scenario of what happened, and then Alicia's going to give you more background, and then we'll come back to these cases, and I'll talk a little bit about the outcome. The very first scenario I want to share with you happened to be 2 high school freshmen, girls, who had been friends the year before, and I'm going to refer to them as Mary and Beth. The first of the year, Mary started hanging out with a very different social group than she had been with before, and Beth was not included in that. Beth at one point noticed that Mary had given a lanyard, which had been a gift that Mary had given to Beth for her birthday, and she had given it to one of these new girls. Beth had felt very hurt. She had felt angry. She felt betrayed. And so when she had an opportunity one day, they were in the locker room getting ready for soccer practice. She noticed that the girl had left the lanyard on her gym bag. So Beth went ahead and took it. Another girl in the locker room saw that she had taken it and reported it to the girl, which then that girl then reported it to Mary. Mary was pretty upset, and she confronted Beth after soccer practice. Why did she take the lanyard? Beth said she had not taken it. And so the conflict started. There was a lot of back and forth. It went to social media back and forth. There was talk about, we need to settle this. And they did decide then to meet after school the next day across the street to settle, to have a resolution. Both girls left. Mary left with a friend. Beth left with a friend. They got across the street, and the dialogue started, and it very quickly turned into a physical fight. Now, both Beth and Mary have older sisters in the school, and they were coming out of the building, saw what was going on. And of course, when Beth and Mary got into the fight, the two friends jumped in, and then the two sisters came over, and they jumped in. There was a cousin involved, and the next thing we've got 7 girls in a full-blown physical fist fight, which got stopped by the security officer from the school, and it did get referred then onto our center, and it was all 7 girls received an assault charge, so they all got referred to the center. The next scenario I want to talk about is a case where we had a middle-aged woman that we'll call Alice, who was walking home from the store this summer. She noticed a dog up the street on the sidewalk that was very agitated and barking, and it scared her. And it was a pit bull, which I think also put some fear in her. She moved to the center of the street, and she noticed there was a young gentleman across the street kind of talking to there was a young gentleman on the porch where the dog was, and we'll call him Mark. And these two were kind of talking. She saw Mark lean down, and the next thing she knew, that dog bolted at her, jumped on her, attacked her, knocked her down, bit her on the wrist. She screamed, she was kicking, she did all sorts of things to get the dog away. She finally got up, ran away. She doesn't recall if the dog was called off, but she got about two blocks away, called her husband. He came, picked her up, took her to the emergency room. Of course, the case was reported, and then the young gentleman, Mark, was referred to our center for a dog at large incident to go through a youth victim conference. Third scenario. I have 2 young ladies by the name of Libby and Sarah who knew each other but were not good friends, but they had a mutual, they had a friend mutually that they were very close to. That particular friend reported to Sarah that Libby was talking a lot of trash talk about her older brother to all of their friends. The mutual friend and Sarah asked Libby if she would stop, because he had a little bit of a history with, I guess I'll say, with law enforcement. And she said, they asked, would you please stop doing this? And Libby chose not to. She continued to trash talk him, talk rumors, and then she moved it to social media, and then it also escalated to not just talking about Sarah's brother, but also talking about Sarah herself. Sarah had kind of thought she would maybe try to resolve this, and thinking it through, she said, no, I'm just going to block her on social media. Later on then in the summer, they all gathered at a local high school football parking lot here in Lincoln, where a lot of kids gather, and Sarah's group of friends saw that Libby was there with a group of friends, a smaller group of friends, but they were all there in the parking lot. And Sarah's group of friends, which had heard all of this, knew how hurtful this had been, suggested to Sarah, why don't you go over there and settle it? Why don't you just go over and get this taken care of? And Sarah's thinking, I'm not sure that's a good idea, but there was lots of encouragement. And needless to say, Sarah made the decision to go over. She confronted her verbally, and I believe that Libby said something that kind of triggered her temper even more, and then it became physical. Libby never physically fought back, but her boyfriend finally stopped it. Sarah and her friend left, and later that night, the police showed up at Sarah's house, and she was given an assault charge, and it was also referred then to the center for a youth, a victim youth conference. Alicia, those are the three scenarios. She's going to go ahead and tell you now a little bit about what the next steps are when after they've been referred.
Thanks, Claire. So we wanted to start off just by setting, kind of setting a stage of the types of cases and really put into your minds the variety of cases that come through the centers. And then as Claire and Casey mentioned, later on, we're going to talk about what actually ended up happening in those cases after they had the opportunity to participate in the VYC program. But before we get to that piece, one of the things that I wanted to talk about was why restorative justice really is a great approach to responding to such a large variety of cases. Traditionally, when we think of the way that the justice system responds to offenses, the victim's experience usually isn't the center focus of those responses. But what decades of experience has shown is that the victims have various needs throughout, from the point of the offense all the way through to the resolution, that sometimes get overlooked. And so some of those needs at the front end might be safety and security. So for instance, with the case with the young lady or the woman who was attacked by the dog, maybe now she doesn't feel as safe walking down the street as she did before, or walking past a dog, whether leashed or not, after having had that experience. Other types of needs that a victim might be experiencing at the front end are needs for support or some type of caring presence, some validation as to what they're feeling as a result of the offense, and an opportunity to express what it is that they're feeling as a result of the offense. And then it could be that they need even something as simple as assistance with daily tasks. So perhaps the woman who was attacked by the dog now has, as a result of her injuries, needs some assistance or needs some other type of services that would help her as a result of the consequences of that offense. And also something that we don't think about is what the needs are of the victim is during the resolution. So in the traditional sense, when a case gets to whatever is the prosecuting office, whether it's the city or the county attorney, the focus of the parties are the state, right, and the offender. And the victim who was actually affected by that offense may not really be a huge part in coming to a resolution about that offense. So some of the things that some of the needs that victims experience may be having information not only about the case, but about the offender. So in the example that Casey presented earlier with the individual who shot the BB, you know, if those individuals hadn't had an opportunity to speak, maybe the victim would have thought that they were targeted, as opposed to it have been really sort of a fluke that they were hit that way by the BB gun. The victim may need some support people, or be able to trust the people who are who have been identified as those supports. They might also need some education about what their options are throughout the process, or may feel like they want to have a significant voice in the process. Oftentimes, what charge is brought in the court, or what petition is filed by the prosecuting attorney, doesn't depend on what the victim wants to see. It depends on what the evidence allows the prosecuting party to present. And so a lot of times the voice of the victim is left out of that resolution process. And finally, on the back end, even once there's been some resolution to the case, sometimes the victim is forgotten even on the back end in terms of maybe whether or not they've been compensated for their losses, whether or not they've been able to regain the trust in the offender. So in the example of the young ladies fighting in school, these are peers. These are kids who are going to see each other again. And I'd even venture to say that that's a common occurrence when talking about youth who are committing offenses, whether it be in school or in their neighborhoods with their peers, these are people they see again. And so whether or not they've been able to regain or reestablish some type of trust between themselves and the offender, whether or not they've really been able to make sense about what happened from the offense all the way through to the resolution, whether or not they fully understand what the results of the process are and what that means for them, or what that means for the impacts on the offender, or even for the broader community. And finally, there may be some needs for emotional closure at the end of the case. As I mentioned at the beginning, at the front end of the case, they might have a need for expressing how they're feeling about what happened to them. And they might still feel that way at the end of the resolution, even after a resolution has been identified, whether that youth ends up in probation or whatever that may be, whether or not the victim has had a chance to really deal with their emotional response to the offense is often something that is forgotten. But it's these types of needs that restorative justice takes into account when addressing these types of the variety of offenses. And so the victim's experience is just as important, if not more important, through the eyes of the restorative justice in terms of making sure that the victim has a voice. And so restorative justice, the phrase, is really something that can be applied very broadly, or restorative practices can be applied very broadly. You've probably heard the use of the word restorative practices or restorative justice just in the work that you're doing. I was looking through the chat in terms of people who are audiences, and I see that we have a lot of individuals who work with their county diversion or work with youth in some other capacity. So you've probably heard the term restorative justice. And what one way that it's been defined, or an attempt at a definition for restorative justice, is that it's a process that involves, to the extent possible, those who had a stake in a specific offense, and then to collectively identify and address the harms, needs, and obligations in order to heal and put things as right as possible. And that was how it was defined by Howard Zur, who was really one of the leaders in restorative justice as a program, particularly in the United States and in Canada. The goals really behind restorative justice is that victims are involved in the process and in some way come out satisfied with the outcomes of the process. And I use the term satisfied loosely, but that they experience having had their voice heard through the process. As part of that, though, the goal is also to have offenders understand how their actions have affected other people and then take responsibility for those actions. So when in discussions of restorative justice, you'll hear words like accountability, responsibility. Those are the types of things that we want the offender to have an opportunity to do to the individual who was harmed by the offense. And then the goal of the outcomes in restorative justice practices are to repair the harms that were done and address the reasons for the offense. So whether that be specific plans that are tailored to the victim's needs and or the offender's needs, but the goal is that both the victim and the offender will gain a sense of closure and both be reintegrated back into the community. And so you see to the right, I have this figure of the restorative justice, or of the community, the offender, and the victim. And that's because restorative justice really brings in all three of those parties. The focus is on the harms and the consequences and the needs of the victims, but it also focuses on the needs of the community and the offenders as well. So maybe as a result of the case where the young lady was bit by the dog, maybe not only does she feel unsafe, but maybe other members in the community feel unsafe with having that dog or other dogs in the community. And so we want to restore the community just as much as we want to restore victims. And so crime under the philosophy of restorative justice is seen as fundamentally a violation of people and of interpersonal relationships. And as a result, those violations create obligations and liabilities to others. And so in order to address the obligations that result from those harms, whether that be obligations of the offender, but as well as the community and the society, then restorative justice seeks to use inclusive collaborative processes that involve anyone who was impacted by the offense. So anyone who has a legitimate stake in the situation, including the victims, offenders, community members, broader society, in order to heal and put right the wrong that resulted from the offense. What I do think I need to know when talking about how to understand restorative justice is what it's not. And restorative justice is not primarily about forgiveness and reconciliation. Now, those things may happen during a conference, but that is not the core of the purpose. That's not part of the pillars of restorative justice. It's not to achieve forgiveness or reconciliation. Oftentimes, by participating in the process, that is a byproduct of these types of programs. But it's important to note that that's not the primary goal, because sometimes that scares individuals off, whether it be victims or victim advocates, that the process is intended to force them to forgive the offender for the offense. And that is not what a goal of a restorative justice program is. It's also important to note that it's not really primarily intended to reduce recidivism or repeat offenses either. That's something that, particularly from my perspective as an evaluator, that's the type of outcomes that we look for, which again can be a byproduct where youth who happen to participate in these programs tend to be less likely to re-offend, but that's not the primary goal. The words that you heard me say earlier were accountability and repairing harms. And those are really the things that we have to focus on when thinking about restorative justice. And so this translates really, these philosophies and goals of restorative justice end up translating into a variety of programs and different program types. Today, as I later on in our presentation, we're going to talk more specifically about a specific type of program that that has had a lot of growth across the state, and it's really one of our it's a program that's available statewide, and so we're going to focus on that program today. But what RJ practices translate into in terms of program really includes a variety of things. And RJ has been identified as an evidence-based practice for some of those programs by a number of nationally recognized agencies. So whether that includes the Office of Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention, or the California Evidence-Based Clearinghouse for Child Welfare. Those are examples of agencies that have identified restorative justice based on some of the programs that they've evaluated and observed over the years as being, at the very least, promising evidence-based programs, which means that the evidence that exists suggests that the programs have positive outcomes and do not cause harm to participants in them. And some have been identified as evidence-based, which suggests that there have been randomized control trials, or another way to say that is that there's been experimental research that's been done where there's been a control group, and so people who did not participate in the program, and they've been able to compare those youth to people who did participate in the program and have been able to find significant statistical differences between those populations. And so some of the findings have included demonstrating that participating in programs like victim offender dialogue or victim offender mediation, which in the state of Nebraska, when we're referring to youth, we call that victim youth conferencing, or family group conferencing is another type of program that has had a lot of evidence-based studies that have been done, empirical support to suggest that it's an evidence-based program. It is used in both juvenile justice and child welfare. And then there's others that are also considered evidence-based or promising that don't have they might not have experimental research, but they have correlational data that suggests that there have been positive outcomes from participation. So things like restorative circles or peer mediation or other types of programs such as that. And so what some of the findings have demonstrated in terms of using restorative justice practices with diversion populations are that participating in a restorative justice program tended to have significantly reduced recidivism for youth compared to youth who did not participate in those programs. And that was found in a number of different meta-analyses, which a meta-analysis just takes a whole bunch of studies that have been done with different populations at different points in time, and it takes those studies and it standardizes them to see whether or not that program overall is having an effect. And so several meta-analyses have demonstrated that there are lower recidivism rates for youth who participate in RJ programs such as victim youth conferencing or family group conferencing when used in a juvenile justice context. There's also been some evidence in one particular study by Sherman et al. Where they examined 15 different they conducted 15 different randomized control trials. So that's that experimental research. They did that in both the United States and in UK. And they found not only did restorative justice participation result in reduction in recidivism, but it was cost effective. So the amount of, even though there's other avenues of traditional programming that could reduce recidivism, restorative justice programs were anywhere from 3.7 to 8 times more cost effective than using the other programs that they compared them to. There's also been some evidence that restorative justice program conferences improve the level of satisfaction for the court processes by the victims and youth offenders who participate in those programs. And there's also been evidence that there's a greater likelihood that when youth do owe restitution as a result of their offense, when they participate in these restorative programs, they have a higher likelihood of actually paying back that restitution after participating in these programs. And so that was kind of like the national/international perspective on what's been going on with restorative justice, but what are we doing locally? So in the state of Nebraska, there is statutory authorization for restorative justice conferencing that has been codified in the Dispute Resolution Act and in the Juvenile Code that allows the county or the city attorney to use victim youth conferencing or other types of restorative justice conferencing as a juvenile pretrial diversion program. And so programs, anyone who's interested in using these programs have statutory authority in order to do so. And so let's talk about what exactly the program that we're talking about when I say victim youth conferencing. What exactly is that program? So victim youth conferencing, as I mentioned earlier, is what we call, it's our title, or what we call, what in other areas maybe, or other jurisdiction or other states may be referred to as victim offender mediation or victim offender dialogue, victim offender conferencing, something along those lines. And in the state of Nebraska, our program is called Victim Youth Conferencing. And it's a process that provides interested victims an opportunity to meet with their offender, meet in a safe and structured setting with a trained facilitator, and then engage in a facilitated discussion of the offense that took place. And we're going to talk in a little bit more detail about how it is that they have that conversation, how it is that it's a safe and structured setting, etc. But the goal is that the victim is able to think back to that table that we looked at right at the beginning about the victim's needs. Victims are able to tell the offender about the crime's physical, emotional, economic, financial, whatever impact it had on them. They're able to express that directly to the offender in that situation, and then are able to ask questions about why why it is that that offense happened, why it is that they were chosen as a victim, if they were even chosen. They're able to get some clarification and understanding about what happened in that case. And it's also an opportunity for offenders to take some ownership of what their role was in the offense, and then to be involved in creating a reparations plan in terms of what it is that they're going to do to repair that harm. And so the offender is directly involved in developing a restitution plan if there's a financial debt as a result of the offense. And if it's not a financial debt, they're able to work with the victim directly to come up with a way for them to make the victim feel whole again. And so, as I mentioned before, there's statutory authority that allows this program to be used for diversion, but I did think it was important to note that there are other avenues for participation in the program. So the mediation centers, the 6 centers that Casey talked about at the beginning, those centers have made a number of different opportunities for the program to be available to youth through a variety of partnerships. So whether that be through partnerships with the county or county attorneys for youth and diversion programs, or partnerships with the schools, but also our conference host, the Nebraska Crime Commission, who oversees community-based aid grants and approve the community comprehensive juvenile service plans that come from counties. That money is also approved by the Crime Commission to be used for participation in victim youth conferencing as well. And additionally, there's also some funding available through my office, the Office of Dispute Resolution. If some of those other partnerships are not available within a county, or the funding is not available through other means, there's also funding available through my office to pay for those services for you to participate. And then finally, many of the mediation centers have formed local partnerships with entities within their region. The point of me pointing out these partnerships is for any of you who have not made use of this program in your areas or in your counties. This is just to remind you that there are a variety of funds and avenues for you to be able to make use of this programming. And that if one of them doesn't work, we can find one that will work for you. And so before I talk about, we're going to transition now into the actual conference itself. So once a youth commits an offense and has been referred for participation in this program, what exactly is it that occurs? What is it that we do, that the centers do with them? But before we get into that, I did want to take a moment to talk about some terminology really quickly. So you may have heard me or Casey or Claire use words like an individual who caused harm or harming party, or may have used terminology such as the individual who was harmed or the harmed party. And we use these words because really in restorative justice is a movement away from use of words like offender and victim. And so instead we refer to individuals who were harmed and who caused harm. And so when I'm talking through what the process looks like for an actual participation in the program, I'm going to be using words like that as opposed to victim and offender. But that's really what I'm referring to. The person who caused harm is whoever's been identified by the referral source, the offender. But particularly when working with youth, a lot of the times you'll find that both parties are really victims and both parties are offenders in some capacity. So oftentimes with these situations where there's a fight that broke out, for instance, with Mary and Beth at the beginning, there was a lot that went back and forth. Someone stole someone's lanyard, there was some talking back and forth. And so it's really difficult to identify who is the offender and who is the victim. And so we try to stay away from those types of titles. And then there's also a bunch of psychological research that suggests that using those types of words also have stigmas associated with them. And we just want to stay away from that. And so I just wanted to clarify some of the terminology as we move into the next portion of the presentation. So when youth are referred to to participate in victim youth conferencing, the case may be referred by the school, it may be referred, that's a pre-diversion case. It may be referred by the county attorney for participation in as a diversion program, or it may even be referred later on in the juvenile justice process, probation, by court order, etc. But once the case arrives at the mediation center, the center will assign a facilitator who then will reach out to the parties via a letter and a phone call. And after making contact with them, they'll have set up interviews. It was termed an initial private session with the person who caused harm, and a separate independent session with the harmed party. And during those meetings, they'll get to hear the side, the perspective of each of those parties of what happened in the case. Oftentimes the parents are involved in this process as well. And during that time, the facilitator really gets an understanding of what happened from both perspectives. And then there's some preparation. If during this initial meetings, the facilitators will also use this as an opportunity to determine whether or not it's appropriate for the harmed party and the individual who caused harm to meet face-to-face. There are some cases where the youth who was referred after that initial meeting, the facilitator is able to determine that they're not ready to take accountability and have no intent of doing so. And so this really might not be an appropriate process for them to participate in. And another option or another scenario could be that after these initial meetings, that the facilitator will realize that maybe the victim doesn't want to be face-to-face with the offender or something along those lines. And so these initial meetings will take place, and once they determine that the youth are appropriate for participating in the program, then they'll have preparation meetings leading up to the actual VYC conference. And that will either be a conference with the person who caused harm and the harmed party, or in situations where we determined that it was not appropriate for the two of them to meet. We'll talk a little bit about that later, what other options are available to the parties. And so during those meetings and during the actual conference, there's really three primary questions or conversations that are taking place. What we're focusing on is what happened in terms of what happened in the offense from both individuals' perspectives, what was the effect or the impact of that offense, and then we're really, a lot of the time is spent on the impact in storytelling portion. But then as a result, the facilitator helps the parties to address this third question of how can the situation be made better? So what are some reparations or some services that we can put in place to repair the harm that resulted from the harming party's offense? And so when we talk about what happened, the primary goal during this portion of the conference is to identify relevant facts, feelings, and expressions about the offending incident, specifically to that incident, and then relate those issues to present day. So they talk about what actually happened, what individuals felt as a result of what happened, and the experiences. And oftentimes, though not always, the offender will go first by telling their side of the story, and then the other party is invited to ask questions, and vice versa. So then the other party will give their side of the story, and the other party is invited to ask questions given what that person expressed. And it's really about telling the story of what happened and what would be ideal as an outcome from this portion of the conference would be for both parties to talk directly back and forth to each other, and having an opportunity to express to each other what happened and what they believe or what they perceive happened as a result of the offense. Then next is that impact portion of the conversation. And during that portion, the facilitator will guide the parties to discuss consequences of the offense that occurred on all parties. And that'll include, sometimes that's not just limited to the victim or the harmed party and the party that caused harm, but also to their parents, to their peers, to their community. And so they'll talk about what were the impacts and consequences on everyone who is somehow connected to this offense, and try to reach a deeper understanding of what happened and how that impacted others. And so oftentimes the way that this plays out in actual practice is that the victim will be invited to summarize how they were affected, and then the offender is invited to respond or to echo back to the victim what it is that they heard, how to make sure that there's an understanding of what the impact was of the offense. And the facilitators really are the ones who are able to dig a little deeper in that conversation to beyond just the harmed party and the individual who caused harm. But ideally, as a result of this portion of the conference, both parties are able to empathetically connect with each other and understand each other's perspectives of how they were impacted by the totality of the circumstances. And I say that because it's sometimes not, it's a lot of times what's revealed that it's beyond just the moment of the offense, right? So if there was a fight, usually the fight was the offense that got them there, but there's a lot of other pieces that are revealed leading up to that fight that they're able to talk about as well. And then finally, as I said, the goal is really to be future focused. So how can we make the situation better, and how do we move forward from what occurred? And the facilitators will help the parties to address all possible solutions. And when I say all, I mean all. So if you could think of 10 possible resolutions, then they're going to push you past that 10. And so they're trying to help the parties to think of the best reparation or the best means for repairing the harm that both parties mutually are able to agree on. And then those reparations that they determine are then put into writing, and both parties sign that document, and it's shared with the referral source, etc. But usually the victim is invited to share what their request for reparations, and oftentimes the facilitator has had this conversation with the victim ahead of time, or with the harmed party ahead of time, in terms of what it is that they would like to see as a result. And sometimes what they said at the initial preparation meeting changes by the time they've had a chance to talk through with the offender. And so then the offender is asked to respond to those ideas, and then everyone who's present are given possible options, and then they're able to evaluate them together. And really the facilitator's role in this portion of the conference is helping them to do some reality testing and helping them to make sure that whatever it is that they've agreed upon, even if they're both satisfied, whether or not it's something that's feasible and it's a smart and achievable type of reparation. And once they've been determined to be mutually agreeable and realistically achievable, then that's when they are transferred into a reparations plan. And so some of the types of reparations that you might see as a result of the conference may be apologies, or, and that might be written. It could be a verbal apology is satisfactory to the harmed party, accountability statements, restitution, and even with regards to restitution, sometimes what that number looks like may not be what a court would have come up with, but it's based on what satisfies the harmed party again, which sometimes is not, it's less than, would maybe the harm actually resulted in. The other possible resolutions include returning or replacing property, or services for the youth, or services to the victim. They can use, it's not that they have to use just one of these. They can use any combination of these different types of resolutions, and they can come up with their own as well. So if any of these don't really fit into what they have in mind, the parties will come up with that together, again, with the help of the facilitator doing some of that reality testing. And so now that you all have an understanding of what the VYC process looks like, now Claire's going to talk to you about how we took that process in each of the scenarios that she talked about before.
Okay, thank you, Alicia. Okay, so I'm going to start again with the first scenario, which happened to be the two high school girls where the stolen lanyard. This was kind of logistically, it was a tough case to do because we had 7 girls with families, and we did the interview with everyone, and I did determine that I felt that it was going to be very helpful and to bring all 7 together. The parents, I will say there were a couple of parents that were very, very hesitant. They kind of wanted to say, you know what, it's over. We don't want to drag it back up. But what I knew from the interviews, that it really wasn't over. There was still some rumblings going on. There were those dirty looks that were being sent through, during lunchtime and that kind of thing. So we brought them all together, and the 2 mediators that I had do this case determined that they felt the best thing to do was to start with the 2 girls that actually had the conflict. And I thought that was incredibly wise. They brought those 2 girls together, and they, and keeping in mind, and I talk about this also when I do the interviews, that our job is not to make everybody best buddies. That's not what this is. It's about learning how to deal with conflict, trying to come to a resolution, and being able to move forward. So our mediators brought those 2 girls together to have a dialogue about what that conflict was. And they had that dialogue. They talked about the feelings. They got it all out on the table, and there was some apologies. There was some acknowledgement. And then they decided that then the next step was, okay, we've got 5 other girls that were involved in this, and how do we move that forward? When we brought those other girls in, these 2 young ladies that had had this pretty emotional conflict, and they literally led that dialogue that day, where they looked to these people prior to them bringing them in. Both of the girls talked about how can they move forward, and how can those friends and their sisters help them move forward, and what were they going to look to them for in this situation. And that's how that entire dialogue then played out that day. And our mediators really kind of stepped back, and the girls really led the dialogue on what can we do, how can we move forward, what are we not going to do from this point forward, and how so that this does not bubble back up. As far as we know, we've never seen any of those girls back. I think it was one of the cases that we felt so strongly about. There was such good resolution, there was such good dialogue, and young people were learning how to deal with conflict that day. And I think learned how to deal with conflict in the future. The second scenario was with the dog bite, and this one was, again, I did both of the personal interviews. When I talk about my introduction about what restorative justice is, I always talk about the fact that everybody has their own truth. We all experience things in a very different way. We can all have an encounter, whether it be a happy event or a tragic event, and we all take something a little different from it, or we see it a little differently. And this particular case had very their stories were somewhat similar, but their truths were very different. And I think a lot of it had to do with the traumatic fear that Alice had that day. What did come out and I will tell you, she was incredibly emotional. She wasn't sure she wanted to meet with him, and we didn't start with them together. We started with them separately because we also give that option that we can do what's called shuttle dialogue, where we take information and dialogue back and forth. And so that's how we started, was with them separately. And then the young gentleman felt so horribly because what had actually happened in his story, it was determined that the dog's leash had actually broken. He had not released the dog from the leash, but it had broken and the dog had taken off after her. And he was he was so distressed by what had happened, and we did finally get them to come together. There was also some financial restitution. Not only did he apologize to her and express his remorse for what had happened that day, but they also came to an agreement about some of the financial restitution. She had sizable medical bills, and he was able to help pay for some of those. So there was, Alicia talked about oftentimes in these situations that restitution does get paid more readily. We always have an agreement at the end in many of these cases that either involves a written apology or a reflection statement, and oftentimes in restitution, then we identify what that is. We identify how they're going to, kind of a timeline of how they're going to pay it, and then they sign that they're willing to do that. The final case is a case, the case where we had the two girls in the parking lot. And in this particular case, we used a surrogate. And before I talk to you about how that kind of played out and what the outcomes were, Alicia's going to share with you a little bit of information about the surrogate and how the surrogate is used in these.
Yeah, so as Claire mentioned, in the previous two cases, they were able to have the harmed parties meet with the individuals who caused harm. But early on in the process, when the facilitators are doing the interview process between the parties, and they're doing that assessment to determine whether or not a VYC is appropriate, sometimes it's determined either that the youth is inappropriate for participation, or sometimes the victim is not interested in participating. Well, in the situations where a victim declines participation, but a youth is in a situation where they're ready to take accountability, they want to participate in the process, they still have an opportunity to do so through use of surrogate victims and community members. And so a surrogate is an individual who has been harmed. So they have been harmed themselves in some capacity, not in that specific incident, but they come to the conference as a representative of a victim of a similar crime or offense, if possible. So oftentimes the facilitators will try to ask a surrogate who was in a very similar type of offense, a victim to a similar type of offense, and that individual will come to the conference and speak from the perspective of what their harm was and when they were a victim. So they're not speaking on behalf of the victim or harm party who chose not to participate in the conference. They are participating to express what harms they experience, and they speak really from their own perspective. And a community member may also come in and speak as a representative of the community that's more widely impacted. But their goals are really to speak as an advocate for restorative outcomes. And so in Nebraska, we have the unique opportunity to use both adult and juvenile surrogates, and depending on who the harmed party is in the case, the centers do their best to match the surrogate to the actual victim. So if there was an adult harmed party, then they try their best to also have an adult surrogate and if it was a youth, to have another youth come in and speak as a surrogate. And as I said, that individual comes in and speaks from their perspective based on their own experiences, and are able to speak and be a placeholder when a victim has declined to participate in the program. And so in the case, in Claire's other case, the victim did not participate, and instead she had a surrogate participate.
So in the case with Libby and Sarah, we did reach out, and Libby did not want to participate, and we do see that frequently. And when you kind of remember this case, this is where Libby was doing a lot of trash talking about Sarah's brother, and then also trash talking about her. I think there's that fear of, oh my God, I'm going to have to talk about what I actually did to kind of instigate this whole situation. And so they kind of pulled back. Early on in the process of doing our conferences here, we recognized how important it was going to be to bring in youth. And we did a lot of brainstorming. How are we going to do this? Because we were brand new at all of this. And we have a few ways of, or few youth surrogates that we attain. One, we have volunteers that come forward after they've been through the process, and these are youth that have come through here. Possibly they have been the one that has done the harm, but they've come out through the process, I guess for lack of a better word, somewhat enlightened and understand it and believe in it. And oftentimes, like you realize that they're oftentimes just as much a victim as the other person was. We also were lucky enough a couple of years ago to do a peer mediation at Southeast High School, and many of those peer mediators that were trained there had also been in situations similar to this and have that understanding of being a person harmed, and we've also utilized them. So we've been very fortunate, and our mediators would tell you how valuable these youth are to bring them in, because it just opens this dialogue. In this particular case with Sarah and Libby, we did use a youth surrogate. One of the things that often happens when we do that is we might ask them, if you could say something to the person you harmed, what would it be? And so they kind of go through that a little bit. But the other thing that we do oftentimes when we have a surrogate is we have a process that we call an action plan. And that is that we acknowledge the fact that often conflicts like this is probably not going to be the last time that Sarah is going to have a conflict similar to this. We all have conflicts for the rest of our lives, and we don't always all know how to deal with them well. And so we kind of walk you through that process. What would you do differently? What could you have done differently that day? Do you understand, what's your tone when you confronted her? When you said, this was, how did you talk about the hurtful things she had said? And so we walk through that. And when a youth is walking through that process with them, rather than an adult, we get, I think, some really genuine response from those youth, and I think it really resonates in them. So in this case, like I said, we used a surrogate. Our young lady that had been referred here was so incredibly honest, and she really talked very openly about things she needed to do differently and things she absolutely did that she should not have done, and how she would approach it the next time. And so we're hopeful that we won't ever see her again either. We hope. But I think, Alicia, are you going to, no, Casey, you're going to move on from where we're at this point, correct?
No, we're gonna jump back to me. That's okay.
All right, sorry.
That's no problem. This program has been around the VYC program, as Casey mentioned earlier. There had been some provisions for the program to be used initially, but it wasn't really being taken advantage of. And so in 2015, the Office of Dispute Resolution, together with the 6 mediation centers, obtained a grant through the Sherwood Foundation to pilot this program. And the purpose of the grant was really to provide the funding to create infrastructure for the program. And so there was a pilot that took place from 2015 to 16 with an extension into 2017, where that included the Concord Mediation Center in Omaha, and the Mediation West, which is out in the Scottsbluff area. So as you can see on the map, that we had this far west region. We had the Concord Mediation Center, which is, they serve Douglas and Sarpy counties. And also later, the Mediation Center was added on as a part of that pilot time period in Lancaster County, when they were really focusing on Project Restore, which is their school-based program. So the referrals come through the school based on a partnership with the Lancaster County attorney. And so that the first case that Claire talked about with the young ladies in the fight, the 7 young ladies in the fight, that was a referral through the Project Restore program. And the other 2 cases that she discussed were examples of regular diversion referrals. And so the pilot demonstrated some successes where there were kind of the things we were hoping to see, where they were able to get a considerable number of referrals during that time period in those regions. And they found that participants were highly satisfied. Both the harmed party and the individuals who were harmed were highly satisfied with the process and having been able to have a voice in the resolution. But at that point, with it only being offered in such small, limited regions of the state, we were able to obtain additional funding from the Sherwood Foundation to initiate an expansion program so that we could make the program available statewide. So all 6 mediation centers beginning at the beginning of 2018 were given the infrastructure to be able to provide this programs to their service areas. And I think while we have this map up, I know one of the concerns that often comes up when the centers are reaching out to potential stakeholders or referral sources is the concern about the location, the physical location of the center versus their ability to serve the service area. For instance, if you look up at Nebraska Mediation Center, they serve a huge service area. And the way that these centers are able to do that is that they have affiliates in various regions of their service areas who are able to address the cases within throughout the region. So if you're in a county and you feel like the mediation center for your region is too far away, please don't let that stop you from reaching out and from making referrals, because chances are they have someone who is located near you who would be able to provide services to you. And if not, they always are willing to travel to and from any location that's within their service area. And thanks to COVID-19, and so this is one of the questions in the chat that we can talk about a little bit later, but thanks to COVID-19 and the pandemic, we've seen a huge uptake by necessity in the use of virtual conferencing. And we found them to be equally as successful as when centers were doing them in person, which created another avenue for the centers to be able to provide the service to their wide service areas. So as I mentioned, beginning in 2018, we started offering the service statewide and have seen an increase in the case referrals and case numbers over time. So in 2015, there were less than 100 cases. I believe there were 74 cases in 2015 during the pilot portion. And in 2019, there were over 250 cases that were referred for participation in the program. And we're continuing to see the movement and increase of referrals. Even this past year, I've only included numbers through the end of 2019 since we haven't reached the end of 2020, but even through the end of even this year in 2020 with the pandemic, we've still seen significant numbers of case referrals, well over 250 case referrals for the year, just under 300, I believe, so far for the fiscal year. Just about 290, and that's just based on what cases had come in through the end of July. So I'm sure we will bypass what we've seen in previous years, even into 2020, even when 2020 is added to the numbers. But what we've seen is that you'll notice that initially there were only 93 referrals, and that resulted in 70 actual VYC conferences. So that means that after that screening process that takes place early on in the case, only 70 of those cases were able to result in an actual conference. And in the pilot year, only 41 of those resulted in a reparations agreement. And at the end of 2018-2019 fiscal year, we had received 271 referrals across the state, and 222 of them resulted in an actual conference. So a much larger number of cases resulting in actual conferences, and nearly all of those, only 10 of those did not end up having a reparations agreement. So we're not only seeing increases in the number of referrals, but in terms of the number of parties that are being served and the number of conferences that are actually resulting from participation in the program, which that could be explained by there being referral sources having a better understanding of what types of cases to refer. And it also could have something to do with the fact that we have more parties or more facilitators. There's been a number of trainings every year up through 2019 of facilitators, including diverse facilitators. Initially, there were only, of the 71 facilitators who were trained during the pilot, only 5 of them were of minority populations. And since then, that number has increased each year. And so I think being able to have not only more facilitators, but more diverse facilitators also makes there more possibility for the centers to be able to serve more diverse populations. We've seen also that the number of counties that have been served have also increased. So this figure demonstrates the number of counties that were served each year. So when the program started in 2015, 6 counties were served. And in 2019, 16 different counties made referrals to the VYC process. Now that 16 does not include, this is just based on the number of counties that made referrals during that year. But in 2019, the total number of counties that have expressed interest in making referrals were closer to 20 counties, but whether or not some of the smaller counties actually have cases that meet the service definition, sometimes that results in lower number of counties actually making those referrals. And so what we've seen during the expansion, so the expansion year started in 2018, so this includes figures through the end of 2019. What we were seeing were that a large portion of the cases were having conferences with the actual victims, but an even larger portion is using these victim surrogates. And we're still working through the numbers. At that time, we didn't have the numbers that we needed to make comparisons between the different types of conferences, but I believe with the data that we have combined with this most recent year, I believe whenever the next time we're able to present on this program, we'll also be able to make some comparisons between participants and who've met with the actual victim versus with the surrogate. But I was able to do some early analysis of that and found that participants, there were no statistical differences between outcomes of youth met with the actual victim versus meeting with a surrogate. And so that is good news for us. That means that using victim surrogates is not detrimental to the process, in that the youth offenders in the program are still able to see the same positive outcomes. And then the last thing I wanted to point out was just the types of reparations that have been included during the expansion period. Again, that's just 2018 and 2019. But you'll see the majority are using apology or reflection letters, are choosing to incorporate that into their reparations plans. But I just want to note that these are not exclusive. So an individual who had an apology letter may also have included service to the victim and a community service. So these may have some overlap between each of these. But you'll notice, besides the apology letter, which could have been verbal or written, the next largest reparation is other, and that category means that the parties came up with something unique to the needs of the parties. And so that we're seeing a whole lot of, which is something that's unique compared to other programs, is that the harm party and the person who caused harm are able to come up with their own resolution of what is going to repair the harm to the victim. And so there are some other services, that restorative programs that are being done across the state. I just wanted to point some of them out. So for instance, Claire mentioned the peer mediation program that's happening in Lancaster County, or with the LPS schools. It was at Southeast, but they're also having some ground to be able to expand that into some other schools as well. Circle processes, which is essentially where there's a talking piece and individuals come together and talk about a specific topic, and you talk until you have nothing to say. And a talking piece is passed around to give everybody in the circle an opportunity to speak, and that's being used in Greater Nebraska. Teen courts are being used in Hastings. And finally, child welfare restorative programs are also available statewide. And we have a handout. If you look up our presentation under the agenda, we have under our materials, we do have a handout which specifies what child welfare programs are available and what juvenile justice restorative programs are available. And it also talks about what point in the process you can access each of those different programs. And so the last thing that we wanted to talk to you all about, since we have Casey here, and he's the executive director for the Mediation Center in Lincoln, we wanted to mention other types of programs that also achieve the goals of restorative justice. And so he's going to talk about a program that they are developing right now in Lancaster County. And he's going to talk about what that looks like for Lancaster. So,
thank you.
One moment, sure.
Yeah, and just know for Lancaster County, I think all those involved would see this as a huge success. We've had pretty big numbers, and the success rate, meaning those satisfied within the system. I think it started with the county attorney's office and willingness to do it. For us, we have 3 different contracts, one with the county with Lincoln Public Schools and their willingness to have this happen. And then I think key for us are those individuals that are involved on the county level. When the county attorney has a case, we have individuals who are set aside that work on these programs, that they go and work with the county people to work with the family to do this first assessment of, are they willing to participate? And so I think having that first session for people to hear this is something they'd be willing to do. As for mediation, is that willingness. If people are willing to participate in these programs, the opportunity for success is just a lot bigger. And then the accountability of the county people lay out, look, here's an opportunity. And then when we're done with that process, they go back to those county people to check off, can they complete it? And then the county folks get it, kind of diversion officers to the county attorney. I think that has been a huge success for us. We have Project Restore, so we get a lot of cases out of Lincoln Public School. Then for us, it's diversion. And then for a lot of you statewide, we also have a contract with probation and have probation cases. Something we're going to work on is truancy circles, and we're going to begin with middle schools. Some other people in the state have also been doing this, but we got together a bunch of our mediators, facilitators who were school related, probably had a group of 12 or 15, a lot of them administrators, and then we're going to work on truancy. How we're going to do it is that circle process. A lot of what we do is we're trying to create space that turns into problem solving. So some of you have been involved within juvenile court. We do what's called pre-hearing conference. Before any case moves forward, within a pre-hearing conference day, the day of court, we bring people together. And we try to get stuff moving forward in a way that can be more problem solving than punishment. So with the pre-hearing conferences, we're going to have, with the truancy circles, we're going to have a pre-meeting where we're going to meet with the individuals first. I think with our victim youth conferences, this is another area of success. When they come into a conference, they've had the opportunity to think about what has happened and what they're willing to offer and to prepare for the meeting. Some of the most difficult conversations we have in our lives, we don't prepare for them. And I think these pre-meetings are really important. So they're going to come in and we're going to meet with our facilitators so they'll know what these truancy circles, what they are and what they aren't. The reason we're going to use the circle process is to create space where people aren't thinking about how I'm going to respond, but in some way with the circle process, you have something you're holding on to and it's your moment to speak. And it's also your moment to listen. And so we're going to create space with a small group of people who are all involved, parents, youth, someone from the school that can be supportive, a facilitator if we need some support people. And we're going to have these people prepared to walk through to come up with something that's really important. So Alicia, if you would go, so in these individual meetings, it's what's going to go on next. So prepare for the length of the circle, the options of change, and then if you would get to the next section, I think important in this, right there, like most of our process, we're going to talk about and have them prepared to share what's the strength of the youth and the family. We know we're building upon strengths. Also, what's the future for that family, that youth? What are they hoping to do? And for them to reflect on what's happening with the impact of absenteeism. I remember doing a victim youth conference. I had a youth and his grandmother, and the youth boxed someone over the head with a metal bottle. And we asked, okay, who's impacted? And the youth couldn't come up with someone, and the grandma was crying beside him. Is that it was affecting their scholarship and their grades. And so part of absenteeism is, can we have the family share and share in this circle process the impact of what's happening? Then the next one is, and this is mediation stuff, what are the options for possible solutions? So when we're going to meet in that pre-meeting, we're going to have families start thinking about what they have done and what they could do differently. So if you would scroll down just a little bit new, and one of our administrators at LPS came up with something, we're going to share something you agree upon to stop doing that's probably a part of making truancy happen, and those things you're going to agree upon that you're going to start doing that might make this different. And so when we're preparing people, they'll have an opportunity to have a few days to kind of come up with something. So when we come into the circle, everyone will be prepared to do that. So Alicia, if you'd go down just a little bit more, I want to get to, at every truancy circle, what we know is on the next sheet, there are certain things in truancy that are going to happen. They're going to have to agree to having a certain part of participation in school, and they have to hit that, and their grades are going to happen. So for us, that's a given. So when they come up with the agreement, they're going to have that already in there. And then we're going to walk through in this circle process and talk about the student strengths. And Alicia, you go to the next page. The goals of the roots of what's happening, and then the options, and down in that option section will be some givens, and then we want to see some creative things that people of what they would be willing to do from this point forward. In that truancy circle will also be the person from the county that has to sign off on this. So when this is all said and done, the person from the county is in the circle that ultimately will take it back to the county attorney to see if we have addressed this in a way that the county attorney would approve when it's all said and done. So we are starting to get some of those cases now. This is a new process. I always say in facilitation mediation, there's always a next new thing. But once again, it's the opportunity for people to feel like the energy is toward we're going to problem solve, and we're going to try to create resources and support around them so they can be successful to meet those goals. So we have talked about an awful stuff. Someone has anti-bullying, restorative circles with 5th and 6th graders. Oh my gosh, that's great stuff. And so we're going to get together with Andrea because we're also going to talk about victim youth conferences. Is the truancy document available? Yes, it would be. If anybody gets to me, or I can figure a way to have that posted, that's the work that we have done for Lancaster County. We'd be happy to share that with anybody. Any other questions, comments before we conclude our time?
I do see a question in the chat that hasn't been answered, and I was trying to type it out, but I'll just respond vocally. Andrea Evans asks whether or not there were some scholarships for increasing opportunities to train more minority facilitators and increase that number. And as one of the conditions for the Sherwood Foundation grant that we obtained for the expansion of this of the program statewide, that was actually one of the goals that we identified for ourselves, is that we wanted to see more diverse facilitators. And so there was actually a push for all of the centers to recruit diverse facilitators. And so we did, and as part of that, we did offer some scholarships where the training was paid for those individuals. And so we have been able to see an increase in the number of diverse and minority facilitators. And another way that some of the centers have been addressing that, and I'd like to highlight Concord Mediation Center in Douglas County, where they have, really have had a need for meeting the needs of the ethnic minority populations. And so some of the ways that they did that not only was through recruiting minority facilitators for the center, but they've also made some changes in staffing where they've increased the diversity within their own staff, so that even while they're reaching out to referral sources, that they are able to demonstrate internally what they want to demonstrate externally as they're providing the service. So that's definitely something that's on all of our minds, and it's something that we have been making an effort to improve on as the program continues to go.
We're down to our last minute. If you ever have any questions, Alicia at the Office of Dispute Resolution, Claire and I at the Mediation Center, feel free. Once again, we want to grow restorative justice practices, not only in our area, but across the state. So we really appreciate your time and listening to the great work that's been happening. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.